So if you're a founder or CEO, if you're on a board, or if you have a significant equity position in the company where you work, this is your homework for tomorrow. Go do this filing. It's so easy. It's so necessary. And I think it's kind of a no-brainer. If you're in healthcare especially, but really, honestly, if you have any extra financial goals or values at all, okay, any non-sociopathic company needs to do this.
Today, I'm joined by a guest who truly needs no introduction for any builder or innovator listening. Eric Ries is the creator of the Lean Startup methodology, which really changed how a generation of entrepreneurs built products. Today, he's here to talk about his new book, Incorruptible, which has a ton of great learnings for us in healthcare. It asks, how can we build companies that stay true to their mission once they actually succeed? We're going to dive into how healthcare leaders can build organizations that are structurally, intrinsically, and permanently mission locked. Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. Eric, thanks for being here.
Oh, always good to see you.
First of all, congrats on the book.
Thank you.
I'm excited to dive in. I had so many questions, and this touches upon healthcare in so many ways. So Incorruptible, it's technically a business book about governance and systems. But within healthcare, I noticed case studies like Novo Nordisk, Devoted Health, Johnson & Johnson. Why does healthcare keep showing up? What is it about our industry that makes it such fertile ground for studying mission drift?
I think it is more confusing to people in other sectors what the purpose of their company is, and it's more obvious in healthcare. Now, unfortunately, that has not stopped corruption from coming from these organizations because we live in the era of what's called shareholder primacy, noticeably very much not patient health primacy or being of service primacy, right? It is a purely financial idea of what organizations are meant to be. And I think I like to use healthcare examples as case studies, not just because it's obvious to the people who work in them, the doctors, the nurses, the people that provide the value, the scientists, what the purpose of the organization is, but it's much more obvious to all of us because we all have an interaction with the healthcare system, whether we want to or not. And you can easily imagine that when you are talking to a doctor or a nurse, you're really glad that they took the Hippocratic Oath. You would not be thrilled to hear that the oath that they had taken was to shareholder value only. That would be pretty upsetting. And yet we don't really process the fact that the boards of directors of these organizations think of their duty primarily in financial terms, in shareholder terms, which I think is just a catastrophic mistake.
Yeah. When I was in business school in 2009, we were taught shareholder primacy. And so our listeners know what it is. It's really that your fiduciary duty is to maximize shareholder wealth. And there was an acknowledgement that this wasn't a perfect framework that we were learning, but the solution that we were taught as business school students was to lead with our own ethical compass and be willing to become a whistleblower. And actually, Frances Hagen, the Facebook whistleblower, was in my section in business school. She's been on the show. Now there's a movie coming out with her for her bravery. But anyhow, tell us about the history of shareholder primacy. How old is this concept? How did it get codified in business?
It's kind of a wild story. And I talk to a lot of people for whom I'm the first person they've ever heard the story from. Even people who have gone to law school or business school or have been on boards or have been top executives, a lot of them do not know this history. And in fact, they've been taught a mythology instead. The idea that shareholder primacy is some kind of ancient pillar of capitalism and to attack shareholder primacy is to attack our economic system itself. Oh no. If you go to your local park, you will probably see trees older than shareholder primacy. Okay, so it is a relatively young idea. So let's go back. For the vast majority of the time that there have been joint stock corporations wandering this earth, it was seen as quite obvious to pretty much everybody involved, whether they were in the company or without, in regulating or working for or buying from these companies, that they were far too dangerous to be allowed to be formed for selfish reasons. So, for example, in the 19th century, if you wanted to form a corporation in America, you would have to go to your state legislature and apply for permission. It was not automatically granted the way we do incorporation today. And in your application, you had to say not only what the purpose of the company was. Like, you were not allowed to say it's just to make money. That wasn't even allowed. You had to say the purpose of this company is to build a railroad from point A to point B, or to dig a canal and operate it between this place and that place. It had to do something specific. And that specific thing had to be in the public interest. You had to actually say in your application why the public has an interest in allowing this corporation to form.
And would you get rejected if it wasn't in the public interest?
It's stronger even than that. I want you to imagine a situation like we have all the time in our modern economy, right? So imagine you're in the 19th century and you're the richest man on the planet, and you decide to use your unlimited wealth to borrow a bunch of money from banks to go take over some company with the intention to change what it does. Today, that's like super common, and we'd be like, yeah, if the richest man on earth wants to buy something, it's his. It's pretty much automatic, okay? But in those days, it was not seen as automatic. In fact, boards of directors were allowed to resist this takeover by any means necessary. That was considered completely normal. And of course, there's all these famous scandals of the 19th century where both sides in these fights would resort to outrageous, unethical and illicit actions. So there's one, I mentioned a canal. There's something called the Erie War, a war over the control of the Erie Canal. It was a giant wealthy financier trying to take over the Erie Canal Company. And if you read the history of this story, it's just totally wild. Like, both sides would go to the state legislature and just outright bribe state senators to vote for what they wanted, and the senators would take bribes from both sides. It's a hilarious. It's a hilarious thing.
Yeah.
And people were outraged by this story. And if you read the 19th century coverage of the story, what's really interesting to me is, although people are upset about the bribery and the other kind of illicit manipulation things that were going on, nobody criticized the board of directors for fighting. That was seen as completely within their prerogative and kind of obvious that that's what they would do. Their job is to defend the company from this corporate raider. Today, under Delaware law, boards of directors are conceived of, they literally call them auctioneers in this situation. Okay. So hey, that's step one. So if you wanted to do this, they'd have a big fight on your hands. But in this case, the financier lost. But let's imagine that he had won. And he said, okay, I'm going to change the purpose of this company from building a canal and operating it to enriching me and my shareholder buddies. That would have been considered a crime. And the courts would void the charter of the company as going beyond the scope of what was authorized. They had a whole legal doctrine for it called ultra vires, meaning beyond the boundaries or beyond the scope. So we've come a long way from this conception of the corporation. Now, was that
a slow journey, or was it overnight in one fell swoop?
Yeah, it was a very interesting evolution, because this idea had a lot of merit to it, and it rested on what I call a three-legged stool, like a very intellectually coherent system. First was this idea of what I call purposeful incorporation, meaning that companies were incorporated to do a specific thing. Then the board, borrowing from the common law tradition of trustees under trust law, were seen as trustees of the corporation. They had a fiduciary duty to preserve and protect the corporation itself. So when the board was resisting that financier, that was considered normal as part of their trustee duty. In the same way that if someone passed away and you were the trustee of their estate and someone came and tried to steal the estate from you, you'd be seen as your legal duty to prevent that from happening. Yeah. And they had a third leg of the stool, the agent's duty from agency law, again in the common law. An agent is like, this comes back from the ancient Roman times when, like, if I am a slave owner and I send my slave as my agent into the marketplace to get something for me, the agent's duty is to maximize my instructions, do them faithfully. And I, as the person who sent the agent, bear liability. I have responsibility for what they do. So in this case, the board was seen as agents of the shareholders, but a very limited form of agency, a negative duty to prevent the funds that were given from being misappropriated. So if I give you money to dig a canal and you want to use it to do something else, that was seen as being fraudulent to me, the one who gave you the money. So that was a three-legged stool: purposeful incorporation, the trustee's duty to preserve and protect, the agent's duty to maximize. Okay. So that system worked great until industrialization hit. And we started to need a lot more corporations, like a lot more. And state legislatures were not a great place to adjudicate these decisions because they were locus of cronyism and all kinds of other problems. But this was like a democratic problem that required a democratic solution. So this was not done by some like backroom smoky lounge thing. Like corporate reformers went state house by state house over the course of the second half of the 19th century. It took like almost 60 years to complete this.
Wow.
They advocated for an idea they called general incorporation. General incorporation meaning that anybody should be allowed to form a corporation for any purpose. Notice, for any specific purpose. Okay. But you shouldn't have to go to the state legislature to do it. This law, the modern version of this law, came to Delaware, the key state for our purposes, in 1899. Okay, so this is not ancient history. 1899 is really not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. All right. So starting in 1899, you could form a corporation in Delaware. And if you read the statute, it's really fascinating. It's like, what are the requirements of this to form a corporation? You must have 3 people, one to be the treasurer, one to be the secretary, one to be the president. You must fill out this form and file it with Delaware. And the third thing is you must state in the corporate charter what the company is for. So it was still purposeful incorporation, but no longer constrained to the state legislature. But then over the course of the 20th century, this started to come under a lot of strain because lawyers started to advise their clients, look, you have to write something in this, what is the purpose of your corporation box? But anything you write is kind of constraining. You know, it's like
I see where this is going. Yes.
You see where this is going. So they started to teach companies to write, and we still do this to this day. If you have an incorporated company, you go check your charter. I do this exercise with founders all the time. I have a room full of founders. Everyone who's read your charter, you know, raise your hand. Very few people even raise their hand. Yeah. But the ones who do, I say, before you raise your hand, if I pop quiz you right now and ask you what the first sentence of your charter is, you can tell me. No, everyone's hand goes down. But I can tell them they're all the same. It always says the Acme Corporation is hereby incorporated to pursue, and it's like a Mad Lib. There's like a blank line. And lawyers started training founders to write any lawful act or activity. Any lawful act or activity, which is actually like a really funny formula if you think about it. And I ask people, call your lawyer. Ask them, does any lawful act or activity include, for example, like let's say in the future it becomes legal to turn my customers into Soylent Green and eat them. Is that included? Yeah. They're expecting the lawyer will say, no, of course that's not included. In fact, if you want, you can easily write in any lawful act or activity except Soylent Green. But lawyers don't say that. The lawyer will say, you never know what you might need to do. Maximum valuation comes from maximum optionality. This is how it's taught in law school today. So that was a bit of a problem. But that's still not the modern idea, which is even worse. So companies started writing any lawful act or activity, and this required the courts to step in over and over and over again to determine what's allowed under this standard. Because what would happen is, you know, Henry Ford, that was a famous story where he got into a big lawsuit with the Dodge brothers over whether any lawful act or activity allowed him to basically do whatever he wanted, or were there some limits. So like there were always these lawsuits happening where someone would allege that a company's not doing what it was supposed to do, and they would have to fight it out. And so over the course of the 20th century, the courts had to do more and more and more of this adjudication. And the standard of any lawful activity didn't give them enough guidance to do it. So starting in the 60s, a group of legal academics and judges hit on this idea of shareholder primacy. Now we're coming into very recent history. They alleged that it would be simpler and easier for the courts to adjudicate if we had this standard. And so starting in the 1980s, okay, this came to Delaware in like 1986. Okay, so we're talking Depeche Mode, not like Mozart. Okay, this is a very recent thing. These judges decided that whenever you see any lawful act or activity, actually that means maximize shareholder value. It's bizarre, actually. Think about it. It's like, what
is
are
there
these two
a person
things
who coined that? Is there like a singular person or a group?
There isn't.
That...
You know, people mostly attribute the change to Milton Friedman. He was the most prominent of these people who advocated for this, and he wrote a very famous op-ed in 1970 where he said the purpose of a corporation is to maximize its own profits or something. That's like he had like a special formulation for that.
He was UChicago. Is that where we can point the blame? Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
not Harvard.
The economic doctrine of this comes from the Chicago School of Economics. But interestingly, even Milton Friedman and the economics people took it for granted that although, yes, that they were very they would have hated ESG, hated stakeholder capital, they would have hated all that stuff. But they still were very much into like long-term value creation. And they really believed that this theory would be beneficial to shareholders because it would free companies to become more efficient, more long-term value creating in the long term. That is absolutely not what has happened. Their theory was just wrong. Okay. They would be so scandalized by what passes for like modern economic best practices. They would be like, what? This is not shareholder primacy. This is extraction primacy. What the hell are you guys doing? So anyway, but that literally just in the 80s. And if you compare it to general incorporation was a democratically legitimate idea. It was fought out in state houses. It was subject to much legislative debate and activity. Shareholder primacy has no such track record. It has never in the history of the world ever been put to any kind of referendum or legislative action. It was just decided in the courts, and it was just decided on by all these business and legal academics. Yeah. They formed what they called a normative consensus in favor of this idea. Normative meaning not just what is how people behave, right? So like a descriptive consensus would be like, look, managers all think this way, therefore, right? No. Normative means, they said, look, because everyone agrees that this is how managers should act, therefore it is the law. And it's actually really interesting. How could something be the law if it was never enacted by the people? So this is this very weird idea where if you talk to any CEO, any board member, any graduate of any of our elite educational institutions and ask them what the purpose of a corporation is, they will recite this to you chapter and verse. In the Elon versus Sam Altman trial, which was like a farce for so many reasons, but like one of the things that Elon's lawyers were able to do is get Satya Nadella on the stand, CEO of Microsoft, and they just asked him, first thing is, you're the CEO of Microsoft, right? What is your duty as the CEO of Microsoft? And he's like, to maximize returns for shareholders. That wasn't news. Everyone's like nodding along like, of course it is. Yeah. Of course it is. And it's like, to me, this is a really wild idea. Most normal people cannot believe that this is the world we live in because we teach companies to have a mission statement. Most companies have a mission statement, which is at odds with their legal purpose. And so I think most mission statements are frankly lies. And I don't think the people telling them even realize it. They often find out too late. So that's how we got into this dismal state of affairs.
Fascinating. And, I really feel like there's some general tension here, and you can kind of see the next evolution. Our parents' generation really bought into the American dream of getting rich and saw making money as a virtue. But much of Gen Z seems to feel the opposite.
Very
that
different.
Capitalism is rigged for extraction, as you said, and there's really no way to be financially successful without being bad. Curious, like what you're seeing in terms of the generational shift, and then what comes after shareholder primacy, given this generation isn't as enamored with the system as the prior generation was.
Oh yeah, I think the era of shareholder primacy is actually already over. We're like the road runner. We have run off this cliff, but we haven't looked down yet.
Okay.
And so I suggest we replace it with mission primacy. Yeah, like that, if you wonder why does our economy feel like it's collapsing and is in total free fall, like that's why it is eating itself alive. And the generational shift on this is extremely stark. I actually showed an early draft of the book to a University of Chicago economics professor for his feedback. And he was great. He actually really liked it. And, he was like, look, you're too harsh on capitalism, though. Like, capitalism is actually great. Hedge funds are actually great. And I had to be like, look, sir, first of all, you have to understand this book is not about capitalism. All I do in this book is present the data about what is actually going on. If you perceive the data about what's going on as a critique of capitalism, what's going on? But more importantly, young people who've read the book, Gen Z and younger, I've had them say things to me like, this is the first book I've ever read in my life that defends capitalism. So I was like, you have lost the generational argument here. And in fact, I know a lot of people, especially younger people, for whom the very idea of forming a for-profit company is anathema. Because they just cannot believe that a for-profit company could ever do anything good. They have lived through, in their lifetime, they have lived their whole lives under shareholder primacy. So institutional betrayal and collapse is all they've ever known. But our grandparents would have found that to be a very sad state of affairs because we used to really see for-profit companies as potential engines of progress in broadly shared prosperity. So we have to get back to that. I think that is the urgent task. And to do that, we have to restore purposeful incorporation to the center of what it means to be a corporation. And certainly in healthcare, these tensions are becoming completely unmanageable. And in the book, I have lots of data about, what happens to hospitals and nursing homes when they get taken over by private equity. So many stories of, even in pharma, what are called killer acquisitions. A lot of pharma R&D activity is designed to shut down the R&D of a rival. These are all examples of value-destroying ways to make money. And our grandparents would have had none of it. They would have said that is a corrupt way to make money. And we don't even have language for it anymore. So I'm kind of on a crusade to bring back this old-fashioned idea of corruption and therefore the ability to build an incorruptible company if we stick to these old-fashioned virtues.
Well, let's talk about healthcare. You describe in your book the layers of administrative complexity and misaligned incentives as barnacles on a ship. We've been trying to figure this out. How do we get rid of these barnacles?
Yeah, well, look, obviously healthcare is a complicated, big topic, and you're more expert at it than I am. But from the outside perspective, looking at this like from the point of view of someone who's looking at what's wrong with all companies, it seems to me like the people that create the value in healthcare, the nurses, the doctors, the scientists, like they are getting paid an ever smaller share of the money that is being spent on healthcare. Same thing's happening in education. University administration is consuming more and more and more of the money that used to go to teaching and to research. And you're seeing this across the board in cases where the managerial class and its prerogatives are consuming more of the resources. So that to me is kind of the root problem, that the people who are making the decisions have become self-interested. So in the book, I described someone who had left a big tech company after having worked there for like 15 years. And he said the problem with this company over time is that as the company evolved, decisions went from being made for the benefit of the customers to being made for the benefit of the company to eventually being made for the benefit of whoever was making the decision. And once we have a managerial system and a governance class that has reified the idea that you should be allowed to exploit an organization, to extract value for yourself at the expense of the whole, such an organization is guaranteed to collapse eventually. Like that is an unstable equilibrium. It's like you have like the superorganism has an illness, an autoimmune disorder is being eaten alive from within. So we have to find a way to cure this disease. And it's not going to work by moral suasion is not going to get it done. You can't shame people who are being paid to do a job, to do a thing. These people are being paid to wreak this destruction. It's their job description. It's both what they think their job is and also what their job contract says it is. It's just that's too tight an alignment. Instead, we have to build organization that are controlled not by the shareholders, not by the managers for that matter, but rather where the mission has a controlling interest. And though if you look at the exceptions to the rule, like that's what's really interesting to me. This phenomenon has been going on a long time and getting worse because if you look at the last 200 years, it's a history of financialization and its increasing power. If you talk to most normal people about this and say, why does this happen? So, think of a favorite company that betrayed its promise to you. And sometimes they'll go right to healthcare. That's very common. But sometimes they'll go to their cable company or like a lot these days it's private equity owned consumer brands. People go right to. I become people's go-to person to send their corruption stories to. So like every day I got to know. Like for a while I was telling the story of Panera Bread to everybody, but
you can tell exactly when these restaurants are bought by private equity.
You can taste it in the food. It is disgusting.
You can taste it.
And if you go to the subreddit, all these brands have subreddits of super fans. Someone just sent to me, the most recent one I got sent was a tortilla company. Okay, tortillas, for God's sake. Acquired by a big public company. Now the food is disgusting. The tortillas taste bad. They used to be like celiac disease friendly. Now they're not anymore. Just like 100 things. And if you go to the subreddits, people are just like, oh no, not again.
Yeah.
We're swimming in this. So most people would just say, look, it's inevitable that this will happen. It's greed. It's, companies get to a certain size. They have a certain age. They're in a certain industry. They're public. It's quarterly this. But the weird thing about this supposedly inevitable force is that there are these exceptions. And if it was
Can we talk about a healthcare exception that
let's talk about some exceptions.
Love as an example, like Novo Nordisk is.
Yeah, right. Novo Nordisk should not exist. Like that's what's really interesting to me. And I give these examples. I'm very hesitant to write a book in this day and age where I hold any company up on a pedestal. Okay, none of these companies are perfect. I'm not saying they're God's gift to humanity. Okay,
I learned that lesson in my book. Yeah, there's so much time between you write it and it comes out, and anything
God
can
only
happen.
knows. Listen, Anthropic's in this book for God's sake. So it's been very stressful. But what I try to remind people is we live in such a polarized age that people think it's a gotcha Like I've had people come up to me and be like, you said Novo Nordisk is great, but they did something bad one time. I'm like, that's not a gotcha. What is remarkable about Novo Nordisk is not their perfection, but their longevity. The mission of Novo Nordisk to do scientific research has been preserved for more than 100 years because it has this very unique structure, which we'll come back to in a second. But the exceptions all are like this. There's just so many. There are actually a ton of them in our economy. And if you look at what they have in common, it's very little. They don't have common values. They're not in common industries. They're not from common geographies. They were not started in the same decade. They're not run by the same managers. What they have in common is they basically violate all of today's best practices about how you're supposed to lead and govern a company.
Around governance.
Yeah. So Novo Nordisk, our modern financial theory that runs the world would say these companies are impossible. They shouldn't exist. So the fact that they do exist and they're kind of hidden in plain sight is already evidence that our modern financial theories are wrong. They must be, because these companies can't exist. And I can remember the first time I met a company with the Novo Nordisk structure. Novo Nordisk is an example, for those that don't know, of what's called the industrial foundation structure, a structure where a nonprofit company serves as the mission guardian for a for-profit subsidiary. So first time I met a company like that, I was meeting with the CEO and their top, 100 or 200 global leaders, doing a lean startup workshop some years ago. And they explained the structure to me. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. That must be rough. Run by a nonprofit.
The nonprofit overlords, yeah.
Yeah, you must have to deal with a lot of virtue signaling nonsense. And gosh, I guess you can't raise money from our global capital markets. You probably can't be globally competitive and efficient. You don't have the discipline of the market to. And they just started laughing at me like I had said the dumbest thing they had ever heard. Because in fact, I had. I was so ignorant. I was like, look, our modern financial theory predicts that your company's in big trouble. And they were like, we would never trade. We would never trade. Our structure for theirs. Our structure is way better. And I was shocked. I was like, what? And I started to look into it. And it turns out that not only is this structure exceedingly common, there's a whole body of academic research of people who study these structures. And they're screaming into the wilderness. No one listens to them. But they have found that these structures outperform our so-called best practices, sometimes by 5x. It's unbelievable how much better they are. So anyway, Novo Nordisk has had this foundation-controlled structure since the 1920s when it was originally set up, because the founders, one of whom was a Nobel laureate, by the way, they could see in 1920...
Female founder too, right?
And well, interestingly, Marie is not officially credited as one of the founders, but yes, obviously she was. And in recent years... She should get credit for this. Her contributions have been more and more recognized. And in fact, the famous August Crow Prize was recently renamed the August and Marie Crow Prize to recognize her contributions, because, of course, the whole idea for the company in the first place was hers, because she was the one who had diabetes. She was the one whose life was saved by the creation of this company. And she was no passive recipient of this. She went with her husband to North America. He had just won the Nobel Prize. They were on a lecture tour together. She had gotten a fatal diagnosis of diabetes and nonetheless went with him to go on this lecture tour. And it was on the tour that she met the scientists who had first figured out how to isolate insulin. She was the one who suggested that they should go to Canada and see the science for themselves. And she and August together conceived this idea to bring this technology back to Denmark, not just to save her life, but to save thousands of others. And they foresaw, decades before Martin Shkreli, they foresaw the danger of a for-profit company with a life-saving therapy. The temptation to be exploitative with that power would be immense. And so they conceived of this structure with a nonprofit, with a for-profit subsidiary, so they could take outside investment. Today, Novo Nordisk is a publicly traded company. I mean, this is not some charity. This is one of the largest companies in Europe, and the foundation that oversees it is the largest foundation in the world, or it will be until OpenAI goes public. And what's really interesting to me about this structure is that it's not just a theoretical. People say, well, how do you know that the reason they've lived for 100 years is because they have this structure? But we know. This is one of those weird business cases where the counterfactual is present in the record. Because sometimes we have to look at paired companies to figure out what happened. Like you compare Hershey chocolate has this structure. Cadbury chocolate didn't have this structure. Anyone eaten a Cadbury cream egg recently? In what the British press deemed the great chocolate betrayal. Okay? Yeah, because Cadbury was taken over by Kraft, but Hershey has maintained its independence. Even better is Tony's Chocolonely. There's a lot of chocolate in this book too, not just healthcare. Anyway.
Healthcare and chocolate.
Healthcare and chocolate
themes.
are the most common things. For some reason, I must have been very hungry while writing this book. In any event, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the pharmaceutical industry was gripped by this new best practice of mega consolidation. The theory that bankers were promising people was that basically that R&D was going to accrue all the benefits to a small number of players. So if you weren't big enough, you would be trampled underfoot and you wouldn't be successful. And so the board of the for-profit subsidiary of Novo Nordisk dutifully was like, okay, that's the new best practice. We better figure this out. And they came up with a plan to merge Novo Nordisk into what at that time was the third largest biotech company in the world. And they had, I think, as far as I understand, a signed merger agreement to do this deal. They were going to get a huge premium over the public price of the company. I think they were like, the company's worth, I don't know, can't remember now, 20 billion, and they were going to get 25 billion or something. They're going to make a lot of money. And from their point of view, one of the very last due diligence items that they had to complete to do the merger was to get the nonprofit trustees to sign off on the deal. So they go and they have this meeting. And the trustees basically say, okay, but what is the purpose of this transaction? And in our modern world, this is not a question that anyone asks anymore.
No.
Because they were like, this is absurd. We're going to make all this money. But anyway, the foundation's like, but we need an answer to this question. Because why do you need to know? Our charter says we can only approve a merger if it is necessary for the survival of the Novo Nordisk mission. And my favorite detail in the story is that they came back for a second meeting. You could just see they were like, okay, time out. We're going to come back and we'll be better prepared.
The story.
We thought this was a due diligence checklist item. We see now that you need a. So they got their bankers together and they were like, okay, let's make a pitch that this is necessary to the survival of Novo Nordisk. And they come back for a second meeting. And again, the board is like, but I don't understand. We've been profitable and growing like 20% a year for 10 years in a row.
Yeah.
What business problem are you trying to solve with this transaction? This question has been utterly lost in our modern economy. We can't even ask it anymore. Every transaction is primarily about financial engineering. The fact that it might benefit customers or something is like a complete side effect. And they write about this very openly. So anyway, the trustees did something that nobody expected. They just said, no, we won't do the transaction. Everyone was so pissed.
Yeah. Did the shareholders sue?
They had no standing. The foundation has absolute control over this thing. So the shareholders had no standing to sue.
In another format, they would have sued.
Yeah,
sure.
Obviously, if not for this exact structure, we know for sure the company would have been sold because there's too much money at stake. What's fascinating about this story? Okay, rarely in business do you get to know exactly what would have happened.
Yeah.
But here we know exactly what would have happened because 2 years later, two different things happened. First of all, the company that Novo was going to merge with itself was merged into Merck, and all of its R&D was shut down. What's called a killer acquisition in the academic literature. Okay, so we know that any research programs that have been going on in Novo would have been shut down by this merger. One of those research programs that had been going on for 13 years without bearing any fruit at this point was the research that would eventually lead to GLP-1. So, Ozempic, Wegovy, those drugs are the most profitable drugs in the history in pharmaceuticals. And I'm not here to say that they're perfect and everyone should be taken as much. When I was in LA, I was like, wow, people were asking me a lot of GLP-1 questions. Okay. So I'm not here even to endorse GLP-1.
We talk about them a lot on this podcast.
I'm sure. So,
they're groundbreaking,
but whatever you want to say about GLP-1, you cannot deny that it's created a lot of shareholder value. And if you freeze frame this,
I think, and a lot of good in the world.
Oh, for sure. No, without question.
Yeah.
So if you freeze frame the story on the moment when Novo Nordisk, on the strength of GLP-1, it eventually had a market cap larger than the GDP of Denmark.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's record scratch, freeze frame that moment. From that moment to the moment that the board said no to this merger, we know for sure that they created more than $500 billion of shareholder value. So when we say that shareholder primacy is not even good for shareholders, this is what we're talking about. It would have been better to have these nonprofit trustees who had no financial stake in the outcome. They made a better, more shareholder-aligned decision than the shareholder-driven board of directors would have been capable to make. Because human beings have been reenacting the Aesop's fable of the goose that laid the golden egg. It's part of human nature. We can't help it. When there's a certain amount of money involved, it's just very natural to cash it in too early, to murder these things in the name of profit. And I've had enough of it. I think, and I think in healthcare especially, it's just ludicrously dangerous.
One of the biggest takeaways from your book for me was seeing kind of the downsides of success. The more successful you become, the more extractors show up at your door and try to just extract, and it ends up destroying everything.
Yep.
So I wanted to talk about specifically public benefit corporations, PBCs. There are a growing number of PBCs in healthcare, like Mark Cuban's Cost Plus, Aledade, Viva, which I believe Viva was the first publicly traded PBC.
Yeah.
Warby Parker. We're starting to see these more. I looked into it a little bit, and it seems quite straightforward to file, especially in California or Delaware. How should founders think about if they should do a PBC conversion? And how does that differ from a nonprofit or a B Corp or other formal recognitions?
So one of the things that's been, I think, has limited the growth of these ideas is there's so many variations and varieties, and you always see this. Human beings are so fractious. The reformers all kind of hate each other because it's like, we compete for very small slice of attention. And so like, I know, having met all these reformers, I know there's like 100 options. But I always tell the reformers when I meet them, you should know that most founders have only ever heard of 0 or 1 of these. Okay. Like maybe you've heard of a B Corp. You've seen the little B with a circle in it at your farmer's market. That's actually not even the thing we're talking about here. So I tried to really simplify this and say, look, here is the like simple flow chart of what to do when. By far the easiest thing in the book is what's called the public benefit corp filing. I mean, we're talking about a 2-page legal filing. You can do it in Delaware or in California. Your lawyers can have it done for you tomorrow. So if you're a founder or CEO, if you're on a board, or if you have a significant equity position in the company where you work, this is your homework for tomorrow. Go do this filing. It's so easy. It's so necessary. And I think it's kind of a no-brainer. If you're in healthcare especially, but really, honestly, if you have any extra financial goals or values at all, okay, any non-sociopathic company needs to do this.
Yeah. Are there any cons to doing it? Is there anything there's
absolutely
are
no
investors going to be annoyed?
No. This has become completely understood and accepted by investors. And it's funny. It's one of these things where if you ask investors if you should do it, they'll always say no, because they don't want anything complicated. They're just like, they've been taught the best practice is shareholder primacy through and through. And they'll often say stuff like this. And in the book, I have a whole section on like how to talk to your lawyer about it, how to talk to your investor about it, a whole separate section for how to deal with kind of passive aggressive, just asking questions kind of skeptics. Like you're going to encounter people who are just like, don't rock the boat. Why don't you worry about this later? Just get product market fit. But one of the most important ideas in the whole book is that it's always too early until it's too late. So if you can hear the sound of my voice right now, and if you have the power to do this filing today, do not put it off. You may not have the power in the future. Other things in the book have trade-offs. This one really doesn't. It's almost no downside. And in fact, the reason it has no trade-offs is that what the public benefit corp filing does, it allows you to write purposeful incorporation back into your charter. So instead of just saying any lawful act or activity, you can say this company exists to promote the public interest of, for example, having like maximizing human flourishing by having our patients be healthy and not die. Very like you write something very simple or something very lofty, you write whatever you want there. It doesn't actually, people sometimes worry that will like lock them into that mission and they won't be able to change in the future. Unfortunately not. All it does is it allows you it basically protects you against being sued by investors later who say you didn't maximize my shareholder value. Lets you say, well, at least I did this instead. So I'm okay. Unfortunately, it is not a mission lock device. That's actually the problem with it. If you actually care about this stuff, it can be overridden. And more importantly, your board can still betray you for no reason. A lot of the stories in the book, if you read them carefully, they're just stories of the board on its own initiative deciding, you know what, we'd rather get the payday than pursue the mission anymore. And those stories are really sad. So a huge problem that we have to solve as leaders if we want to build companies, we have to build what are called mission-locked companies that are not able to be betrayed in this way. And I give a lot of examples, including modern ones like Patagonia and Anthropic, that have adopted these multi-tiered structures where the board is accountable to some outside set of trustees. That's a little bit more complicated to set up compared to the PBC, but I think it's basically necessary. Yeah, absolutely. Step 2.
Step 1 is PBC.
First, yeah.
Yes. Any other closing advice for founders listening?
Okay, so today, the way we teach business, we teach that operations and governance are kind of two different things. So we teach leadership and management and culture and alignment and those kind of things. We teach that as like the operating discipline of how to run a company. And then lawyers and bankers and investors fuss over like who sits on the board and the corporate charter and all these governing things. The most important lesson of this book is that these two things are two sides of the same coin. If you don't get the governance of your organization right, then no other decision you make will matter in the long run because you won't be the one making it. But conversely, structure does not magically cause a company to be incorruptible. Structure can only protect a pre-existing ethos. So I think for a lot of founders listening, especially in healthcare, you have a strong ethos already. Why on earth would you become a healthcare entrepreneur to make money? Like, what a dumb way to make money. Seriously. Like, statistically speaking.
Way easier ways to make money than in healthcare.
So many easier ways. Yeah. Even easier ways in healthcare. Okay. If you didn't care about health outcomes, why would you? Okay. So if you do care about this stuff, then my goal is not to convince you of anything, but simply to give you the tools to defend that insight against people who will try to tell you that the serious way of business is the path of betrayal and becoming a sociopath. I don't want that for you. So you got to study both the leadership side of this and the governance side of it and see how they are integrated into one thing.
Amazing. Erica, it was so great talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Oh, it's really my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And listeners, please check the show notes for Incorruptible, the book. I loved it, and I've been recommending it to every founder that I've been talking to. So,
oh, that's so great.
Thanks.
Thank you for saying that. And everyone, don't forget to like and subscribe. You know the drill.
Yes, like and subscribe.